St. Martin is a small island with a remarkable story. Despite its modest size of just 34 square miles, it's unique in that it's governed by two nations, the Kingdom of the Netherlands on one side and on the other, France. Today, St. Martin is more than just a tropical paradise. It's a place where empires clashed, treaties were forged, and a unique culture emerged. But how did this island come to be one of the only places in the world where one territory is peacefully shared between two nations? In the early days of European colonization in the Caribbean, it wasn't that unusual for rival nations to share islands. In fact, the first inhabitants of St. Martin came from such an island, St. Kitts, which is all the way over in the distance there. St. Kitts was the first English colony in the Caribbean, and its struggling settlement welcomed a French pirate seeking refuge, leading to the establishment of a French colony on the same island. But the Spanish, not being happy about these European nations moving into the Caribbean, which they saw as their territory, decided to kick them off the island in 1629. Some of the displaced French settlers ended up on St. Martin, establishing a small makeshift settlement. However, a Spanish fleet following them from St. Kitts raided the island, further reducing their numbers. Most left, but 14 Frenchmen managed to evade the Spanish and decided to make the island their home. The Dutch came to the island in 1631, believing it to be uninhabited. The Dutch had emerged from the 80 Years' War as a maritime superpower. They'd managed to take over Brazil and found a colony in New Amsterdam, now New York. They were looking for a waypoint between the two, as well as a place for them to get salt. The Dutch quickly established Fort Amsterdam and began mining salt, which proved to be of an exceptional quality. They also encountered the small French community on the island who, recognising the success of the Dutch West India Company, began working for them. By 1633 there were 97 inhabitants on the island. Problems started to arise though in 1633. The Spanish king decided to raise tariffs on salt. This would be completely futile if people could just easily go and get their salt cheaply from the Dutch. 53 ships set sail from Cadiz, and they go with the intention of completely destroying the salt trade on St. Martin. The Dutch do well. They manage to hold themselves up here at Fort Amsterdam for a week, but eventually it's too much, and the Spanish manage to take control of the island. The Spanish do very little, though, in order to protect their position on the island, and the island becomes neglected. The salt operations stop, and only a handful of civil servants are left behind on the island. The Dutch had gone elsewhere, though. They'd set themselves up in Aruba, Bonaire and Curacao, where they could get a plentiful amount of salt, and they were in close proximity to the Spanish Empire, meaning that they could carry out their privateering. In 1642, though, the governor of Curacao, Peter Stuyvesant, is given the orders to take back St. Martin from the Spanish. He manages to take back Fort Amsterdam and goes to raise the flag himself. Just as he believed he had achieved an easy victory, a cannonball took his leg clean off. The Spanish, despite not doing much to maintain the island, had built a small fort on the other side of the bay, and here they hid out from the Dutch. The Dutch tried everything that they could. They tried shelling the fort from Fort Amsterdam, and then they tried a siege to starve the Spaniards out, but neither of these tactics worked. The Spanish governor wrote to the king, asking to be rewarded for having kept away the Dutch. The reward he asked for was to be allowed to leave the island. This was denied, though, and the Spaniards were forced to stay on for another 4 years until the 80 Years' War was coming to a close. When it did come to a close, they brought over workers from Puerto Rico in order to deconstruct their settlement. Some of those workers just so happened to be Dutch and French. And so, when they had finished their work deconstructing the fort, they decided to alert their governors that the island was free again. The Dutch were the first to show up, and at first they didn't want to allow the French to land. The problem for them, though, is they had no man-of-war ships in the Caribbean at the time to intimidate the French. Once they had landed, the two governors met up on Concordia Hill to decide how they would share the island. The French were to stay on the north side of the island, where those first refugees had landed, and the Dutch in the south, where they had established their settlement in the Great Bay. The two nations would share the island's resources, and free movement between the two sides was allowed, an arrangement that has persisted to this day. The relationship between the two sides was not always peaceful. The demarcation line shifted places throughout the 18th century. There were multiple attempts by the Dutch to purchase the French side, mainly because they were being constantly raided by English pirates and privateers. These raids would disrupt Dutch trade, especially in 1779 when the English managed to take over the island for 2 months. The Dutch at the time were trading a lot with the American colonists, bringing in consumer goods which were no longer being supplied by Britain. When 2 American ships showed up on the island, they were seized by the British. The Dutch governor did everything he could to try and get the British to return the ships, but the British just threatened to burn Philipsburg to the ground should the Dutch try anything. Despite numerous attempts by the Dutch, as well as offers from the English and Prussia to purchase the French side of the island, it was never sold. The free movement of people between both sides of the island created some interesting situations. It was very profitable at the time to be a smuggler. The Dutch wanted to trade goods with other Caribbean colonies, and that included the French side of St. Martin. The thing was, though, it was very difficult to enforce these borders, and tariffs were very high in the Dutch Empire, and so you could make a lot of money smuggling things like alcohol across the border. The situation got so bad, in fact, that the Dutch governor ordered that all goods could no longer be transported over land. They'd have to be taken around to the French side by sea. Eventually, though, they just did away with tariffs altogether, but that didn't come all the way until 1939. The freedom of movement also created an interesting situation when it came to the emancipation of enslaved people on the island. The French freed their enslaved population in their colonies in 1848. This was 15 years before the Dutch. Because of the freedom of movement, those enslaved people on the Dutch side simply threatened to walk to the French side, where they would gain their freedom. Therefore, St. Martin abolished slavery, 15 years before the rest of the Dutch Empire. Today, the idea of unifying St. Martin is rarely discussed, though a few voices still advocate for it. For most, however, the island is already unified in spirit. Each side brings its own distinct identity, yet the shared history and cultural exchange between Dutch, French, and African influences have created something truly unique. St. Martin stands as a testament to resilience and collaboration, offering a blend of traditions that make it one of the most fascinating destinations in the Caribbean.